The silence inside St. Alden's Hospital was suffocating. Dust motes floated lazily through the pale beams of light filtering in from broken windows, and the air carried the faint metallic tang of rust and decay. I had passed by the derelict building countless times. Finally, one overcast afternoon, with a flashlight and more confidence than sense, I stepped inside. The entrance was choked with debris. Peeling paint curled like dead skin on the walls, and every step I took kicked up a powdery cloud of dust. My boots crunched on shattered glass and broken tiles, each noise echoing into the vast emptiness. Somewhere deeper inside, a faint creak or shuffle made my breath catch, but I convinced myself it was the wind. The plan had been simple. A quick look around, maybe some photos, and then out. But as I wandered further, my curiosity began to pull me deeper. And then I found it, the stairwell to the basement. The rumors about the basement were the worst. People said the hospital staff used it to store equipment after the closure, but others whispered about secret experiments, strange disappearances, and things left behind. Looking at the rusted metal door that led downstairs, I should have turned back. Instead, I pulled it open. The stairwell smelled of damp stone and mold, a sharp contrast to the dry decay upstairs. My flashlight beam bounced off walls slick with condensation, revealing graffiti, old wires, and crumbling concrete. The deeper I went, the colder it became, until my breath began to mist in front of me. When I reached the bottom, I stood in a long, low corridor. Doors lined either side, their metal surfaces warped and tarnished. Some hung ajar while others were sealed shut. The fluorescent lights above me were long dead, their glass tubes shattered, leaving only my flashlight to guide me. As I moved forward, the sound of my breathing seemed too loud, too invasive. The quiet wasn't just an absence of noise. It was a presence, thick and oppressive, like the building itself was listening. I tried the first door on my left. Rusted gurneys and cracked floor stands were piled in a chaotic heap. The walls were smeared with something dark, and though my mind told me it was likely grease or mold, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. I didn't linger. The next few rooms were much the same, remnants of hospital life left to rot. But one door, near the end of the hall, caught my attention. Unlike the others, it was pristine, its metal surface free of rust and grime. My hand hesitated on the handle, a chill running down my spine. The door wasn't locked, but it was heavy, and I had to lean my weight into it to force it open. The room inside was dark, darker than it should have been. Even the beam of my flashlight seemed swallowed, unable to illuminate the corners. The air was colder here, heavy with a faint, acrid smell that made my eyes water. I stepped inside. The walls were lined with cabinets and shelves, each meticulously arranged with glass jars and tools that gleamed faintly under my light. Most of the jars were empty, but a few held cloudy liquids with unrecognizable objects suspended inside. I didn't want to look too closely. At the center of the room was a single chair, bolted to the floor. Leather straps hung limply from its arms and legs, and the metal surface was discolored in places. I told myself it was rust, but my stomach churned all the same. Something about the room felt wrong, like it had been left untouched for a reason. I was about to turn back when the door slammed shut behind me. The sound was deafening in the confined space, and I whipped around, heart hammering. My flashlight flickered as if in protest, and the room seemed darker than before. I tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. Then, faintly, I heard it, a low, rhythmic tapping, coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, my light darting across the room. There was nothing, no one, but the tapping grew louder. It wasn't just a sound. It was a vibration, a pulse that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I backed toward the door, hands fumbling at the handle, my flashlight beam shaking as my panic grew. Something moved in the corner of my eye. I turned sharply, and for a moment, I thought my light had caught a figure. A pale shape, impossibly thin, slipping between the cabinets. But when I aimed the beam directly at the spot, there was nothing. The tapping stopped. The silence was worse. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. The air felt heavier with each passing second, pressing down on my chest. Then, slowly, the room began to change. The walls seemed to shift, the corners stretching farther away, the shadows growing deeper. My flashlight flickered again, and I swore I could hear faint whispers. Words I couldn't make out, but they were close, too close. The door handle turned under my hand. I yanked it open and stumbled into the hallway, the oppressive air of the room spilling out with me. I didn't look back. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to run, my flashlight bouncing wildly. The hallway seemed longer than before, stretching endlessly, and the faint whispers followed me, growing louder with every step. When I finally reached the stairs, I didn't stop to catch my breath. I climbed as fast as I could, nearly tripping over myself in my haste. The air grew warmer, lighter, the further I went, but the feeling of being watched never left. When I burst through the front doors into the overcast afternoon, I collapsed on the cracked pavement, gasping for air. The hospital loomed behind me, silent and unmoving, but I could still feel its presence, heavy and malevolent. Graymoor Hospital had been the crown jewel of the city once, state-of-the-art, bustling, a place of life and healing. That was decades ago. That, of course, was exactly where I wanted to go. I don't know why I did it. Curiosity, boredom, maybe the need to prove something to myself. Armed with a flashlight, I stepped into the building on a chilly November afternoon. The air inside was damp, stale, and laced with an earthy bitterness that clawed at the back of my throat. Graffiti scrawled the walls, crude shapes and words obscured by years of decay. My footsteps echoed in the cavernous halls, breaking the heavy silence. I told myself the stillness was comforting, proof I was alone. But the deeper I went, the less I believed it. I found the basement stairs in the east wing, hidden behind a partially collapsed wall. The staircase plunged downward, disappearing into a darkness so thick it felt alive. I hesitated at the top, my flashlight cutting through the blackness, illuminating cracked steps and damp walls. The rumors came rushing back, whispers of patients who never left, of experiments hidden beneath the hospital's foundations. My grip tightened on the flashlight, and I took the first step. The basement was colder than I expected, the air heavy with moisture. My flashlight beam danced across the walls, revealing peeling paint, exposed pipes, and rusted doors. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, the sound sharp and rhythmic. I tried to ignore the way the shadows seemed to shift just beyond the edge of my light. The first few rooms were unremarkable. Storage closets filled with broken furniture, old medical supplies, and forgotten files. But the deeper I ventured, the stranger things became. One room was filled with hospital beds, their mattresses bare and rotting. Each bed was bolted to the floor, spaced evenly apart, as though waiting for patients who would never come. Then I found the door. My heart pounded as I reached for the handle. The room beyond was large, its walls lined with metal cabinets and counters. My flashlight picked out scattered surgical tools, each one rusted and corroded, and a few overturned chairs. At the center of the room was a massive operating table, its surface dull and pitted with age. Restraints dangled from its edges, the leather straps stiff and cracked. The air was colder here, sharper, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A noise broke the silence, a soft, shuffling sound, like fabric brushing against the floor. I froze, my light darting toward the source, but there was nothing there. The sound came again, closer this time, and I realized with a sickening jolt that it wasn't fabric. It was breathing. I spun around, my flashlight slicing through the darkness. Still nothing. The room was empty, but the breathing continued, deep and labored, filling the space. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on something, and I hit the ground hard, the flashlight skittering out of my hand. It rolled across the floor, the beam spinning wildly, casting dizzying shadows across the walls. And that's when I saw it. Something moved at the edge of the light, tall, thin, its limbs unnaturally long. It clung to the ceiling like a spider, its head tilting at an impossible angle to watch me. Its face, or what should have been its face, was featureless, a blank expanse of pale skin. My breath hitched in my throat, and the thing began to move. It crawled down the wall with jerky, staccato movements, its limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. The breathing grew louder, more erratic, as if it were struggling to contain some kind of excitement. The thing dropped to the floor with a sickening thud, and for a moment, it just stood there, swaying slightly, its head cocked as though it were listening. Then it lunged. I don't remember running. One moment I was in the room, the thing barreling toward me, and the next I was in the hallway, sprinting for the stairs. The shadows seemed to close in around me, and the walls felt narrower, the ceiling lower. My flashlight flickered, and I could hear it behind me, its limbs scraping against the floor, the walls as it followed. The stairs were ahead, and I pushed myself harder, my chest burning, my vision swimming. I didn't dare look back. The air grew colder, each breath painful and shallow. My foot hit the first step, and I surged upward, the thing's ragged breathing filling my ears. When I reached the top, I slammed the basement door shut behind me and collapsed against it, my whole body trembling. The silence was deafening. For a moment I thought I had escaped. Then the door shuddered. A single, heavy thud echoed through the wood, followed by another, and another, each one harder than the last. I scrambled to my feet, backing away as the door began to bow inward. Then it stopped. The quiet stretched on, the seconds dragging like hours. I didn't wait to see if it would start again. I never went back to Graymoor, but sometimes I dream about that door. And in those moments, I realize the breathing isn't coming from it anymore. It's coming from me. Elmwood Hospital had been abandoned for decades, standing like a decayed sentinel at the edge of town. Its reputation was as rotten as its crumbling walls. People whispered about what happened in the hospital's final years. The mysterious patients transferred in the dead of night, the locked wings, and the unmarked vans that came and went without explanation. But most of all, they spoke of the basement. It was there, they said, that the worst things happened. I wasn't sure what I expected when I decided to explore it. Closure for the stories that had terrified me as a child? Proof to debunk them? Whatever the reason, I couldn't stop myself from walking through the shattered front doors one cold autumn evening. The air was heavy, as though the building itself was still alive, waiting. The main floor was a wreck. Broken tiles crunched under my boots, and the walls were smeared with graffiti and mold. The remains of hospital equipment lay scattered like skeletons, their metal frames rusted and warped. I passed through hallways lined with empty patient rooms, each one stripped bare save for the occasional bed frame or torn curtain. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional groan of the wind through shattered windows. Then I found the stairwell. The door to the basement was ajar, revealing a yawning black void that seemed to breathe cold air. A set of corroded stairs descended into the darkness. My flashlight barely pierced the gloom as I hesitated on the threshold, the beam trembling in my unsteady grip. I told myself it was just a basement, storage probably, or boiler rooms, nothing to be afraid of. Taking a deep breath, I stepped onto the first stair. The descent was slow. The walls grew damp as I moved deeper, and the faint smell of mildew mixed with something sharper, metallic, that stung my nose. The air became colder with every step, until it was almost unbearable, like stepping into a meat locker. The bottom of the stairs opened into a long, low corridor. My flashlight revealed a network of hallways stretching in every direction. The walls were lined with old pipes and rusted vents, their gnarled shapes casting strange shadows. Water dripped from somewhere, each drop echoing like a ticking clock. I chose the left-hand path, the beam of my flashlight sweeping across the walls as I walked. The first few rooms were unremarkable. Storage closets filled with broken equipment, shelves of disintegrating files. But the deeper I went, the stranger things became. One room was filled with chairs, dozens of them, lined up in perfect rows facing a blank wall. Most were overturned, their metal legs bent and twisted. The floor was sticky, and my boots left faint impressions as I moved. Another room was empty except for a single hospital bed in the center. Its restraints were still fastened, the leather straps pulled taut, and deep gouges marred the metal frame. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned a corner and nearly dropped my flashlight. The hallway ahead was different, narrower, the walls rough and uneven as though carved from raw stone. The temperature dropped further, and the smell of damp earth filled my lungs. At the end of the corridor was a single door. The glass was dark, smeared with something on the inside. My hand hesitated on the handle. I wasn't sure if I wanted to see what was behind it, but the door wasn't locked. My flashlight struggled to illuminate it fully, the beam swallowed by the oppressive blackness. The walls were lined with what looked like cages, each one large enough to hold a person. Most were empty, but a few held shapes slumped in the shadows, mounds of cloth or something worse. I didn't look too closely. At the center of the room was a pit, a gaping hole in the floor, its edges ringed with broken tiles. It was as though the ground had collapsed inward, revealing something much older, much deeper. My flashlight beam couldn't find the bottom. A sound broke the silence, a faint scraping, like metal dragging across concrete, came from one of the cages. I turned toward the noise, my heart hammering in my chest. One of the shapes moved. Slowly, it shifted, unfolding itself from the floor until it stood. The thing was tall, impossibly so, its limbs too long, its head brushing the low ceiling. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, or the dark voids where eyes should have been, fixed on me. It didn't move at first. It just watched, swaying slightly as though it were trying to decide what I was. Then it stepped forward. I stumbled back, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The creature's movements were jerky, unnatural, its arms dragging against the bars of the cage as it reached for me. I turned and ran. The hallway seemed longer than before, stretching endlessly as I sprinted. The sound of metal on stone followed me, echoing through the labyrinth. The air grew heavier, colder, until every breath was a struggle. My flashlight flickered, and for a terrifying moment, I was plunged into darkness. When the beam returned, I swore the walls were closer, the space tighter. The stairs were ahead, just visible in the faint glow of my light. I pushed myself harder, the sound of pursuit growing louder, closer. My chest burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare stop. I could feel it behind me, its presence a weight pressing down on my back. I reached the stairs and scrambled upward, each step a desperate climb. The sound didn't fade. It followed, relentless, the scraping now joined by something else. A low, guttural sound, halfway between a growl and a moan. When I reached the main floor, I didn't stop. I ran through the hospital, through the broken halls and past the gaping doorways, until I burst into the cold evening air outside. I collapsed on the cracked pavement, gasping for breath, my flashlight still clutched in my trembling hand. The hospital loomed behind me, silent and unmoving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I don't know what I saw in that basement. I don't know if it was real or if the stories had gotten into my head. But every now and then, I wake in the middle of the night, my room filled with the faint smell of damp earth. And sometimes, in the quiet, I hear it, that scraping sound coming closer.